The server room hummed with a low vibrating frequency, the only soundtrack to the 7 years I gave away to a company that treated me like invisible infrastructure. I built their core enterprise engine line by line, sacrificing relationships, vacations, and my own health to ensure our payment routing architecture remained flawless. But technical brilliance means nothing in an office where nepotism dictates the hierarchy, a lesson I learned the hard way when the owner introduced his golden child as our new Senior Vice President of Innovation. My position as Principal Systems Architect at Valentech was hard-earned through sweat and zero external favors. So when Trevor, a freshly graduated trust fund elitist wearing custom-tailored suits and a condescending grin, hijacked my project channels on his very first morning, the warning bells rang loud and clear. He could not explain the difference between a database query and an API endpoint, yet he immediately scrubbed my signature from all project architecture decks and assigned himself as the sole creator. My department head, Sandra, made it instantly clear where her loyalties rested. When I brought up the fact that Trevor was taking credit for my intellectual property, she folded her arms and advised me to stop being territorial for the sake of team synergy. She cared strictly about pleasing executive leadership rather than protecting operational integrity, leaving me effectively isolated within the departments single-handedly built. I realized then that competence was no longer currency at Valentech. Only titles and optics mattered. The breaking point arrived when Apex Global, a massive international financial network, requested a live demonstration of our flagship routing platform for a $50 million integration contract. I spent 8 straight months configuring the test cluster, bulletproofing security modules, and setting fail-safes for their audit team. 2 days before the meeting, Sandra quietly altered the executive schedule, taking me off the presentation entirely and positioning Trevor as the lead presenter while ordering me to monitor background logs from an overflow room. Instead of throwing a scene or arguing with a management team that had already written me off, I accepted the decision with total composure. I prepared a detailed 20-page technical handoff manual outlining critical dependencies, precise command lines, and mandatory system environment variables required to run the live sandbox. I knew Trevor would consider himself far too important to read technical documentation. I simply delivered the binder, stepped into the shadows, and let consequence take its natural course. On the morning of the high-stakes presentation, Trevor stood in front of Apex Global Managing Partner, Richard Sterling, a ruthless industry veteran who despised posturing. Trevor began throwing around artificial intelligence buzzwords while attempting to navigate my live command interface like a basic web browser. Within 90 seconds, he ignored a flashing system warning, force-executed an uncompiled script, and completely logged the primary server cluster, causing a massive infrastructure error to cover the boardroom monitors. Faced with a complete system crash, Trevor turned to the boardroom camera and blamed the engineering team for building an overly fragile architecture. Richard Sterling did not hesitate. He cut Trevor off mid-sentence, noted that the build logs clearly credited a completely different architect, and asked why the actual creator of the platform was nowhere near the room. Without waiting for a corporate excuse, Richard closed his presentation laptop, stood up, and terminated the deal before walking out. The following morning, Sandra summoned me to her corner office, but there was no accountability in her voice. She informed me that management was reassigning me permanently to internal maintenance and policy writing, while Trevor was taking full administrative control over primary system deployments. They expected me to silently write training material for my replacement, while shielding Trevor from the fallout of his own failure. I nodded calmly, accepted the assignment, and walked straight back to my workspace. For the next 3 days, I constructed documentation that was legally compliant, technically accurate, and entirely useless to anyone who lacked my unique cryptographic access. Following standard corporate security protocols, I agapped the critical deployment engine behind an asymmetric encryption key bound exclusively to my personal system credentials. Without my digital signature, the platform could not compile, update, or push live code. It was not malicious code, it was standard enterprise security that they had signed off on without reading. The inevitable disaster arrived the following Tuesday when Apex Global sent a surprise notice requesting a secondary technical validation attempt before officially cancelling their vendor evaluation. Sandra panicked when Trevor attempted to launch the deployment module, only for the entire terminal to demand my administrative security key. She barged up to my desk, ordering me to hand over my master key immediately. But I remained seated and reminded her of company protocol. I handed her a printed copy of the internal policy sheet she had signed the previous week, which explicitly stated that unassigned personnel were strictly prohibited from providing administrative encryption keys without formal written authorization signed by corporate legal and executive management. I told her I would be happy to help the moment the official paperwork passed through the legal department. Sandra stood frozen, realizing her own bureaucratic red tape had trapped her inside a corner she could not talk her way out of. By mid-afternoon, the executive floor was in complete distress. The chief executive convened an emergency board meeting via video conference to address why our multi-million-dollar contract was completely stalled at the authorization level. Trevor attempted to cover his tracks by claiming the system suffered from a mysterious software glitch, but our junior network engineer innocently pointed out on the shared call that the system was working perfectly and was simply waiting for my administrative decryption signature. The silence that fell over the call was deafening. Valerie Miller, the lead representative for our primary investment firm, unmuted her line and demanded to know why the lead architect who designed the underlying system was locked out of deployment, while an executive with zero technical credentials was attempting to run security scripts. When the chief executive tried to stall, Valerie noted that my status showed I was off the project entirely, scolding management for prioritizing office politics over company survival. Early Friday morning, my personal phone rang with a call from a private number. It was Richard Sterling from Apex Global. He told me his security team had analyzed our platform architecture and realized that I was the sole intelligence behind the entire project. He informed me that Apex Global had officially severed all business relations with Valentech, but he wanted to offer me a direct master consulting agreement to construct an independent routing platform for his firms with absolute operational authority. The contract terms were life-changing, featuring a massive upfront retainer, full project control, and complete freedom from corporate interference. I signed the electronic agreement from my living room table. Minutes later, my corporate email inbox was overwhelmed with urgent messages from Sandra and the chief executive, offering me immediate promotions, retrofitted vice president titles, and substantial salary increases if I would return to the office and release the security keys. I selected every email and permanently deleted them. Around midday, a private courier arrived at my front door, holding a thick leather folder containing emergency legal releases, retroactive bonus checks, and a signed letter of apology from the chief executive. I stood quietly behind the glass, watching the courier wait on the porch before setting the folder down on the welcome mat. They had spent years assuming my silence was weakness and my labor was disposable, never realizing that the entire system rested entirely on my shoulders. I packed my personal files onto a private drive, closed my personal laptop, and left the envelope untouched on the porch as I drove away. Valentech lost their biggest client, their market reputation, and their primary technical infrastructure within a single week, leaving their executive team holding a useless shell of code they did not know how to run. They learned that while titles can be handed out through favoritism, true capability must be earned, and I walked away into the most lucrative phase of my professional life.